Hi, this is Writing a Literature Review for the Biodefense Capstone course. Today we'll talk briefly about writing a literature review, and I'll start with what is the literature. Talk a little bit about that because I think that's a source of confusion sometimes. Then we'll talk a little bit about just the general purpose of a literature review as you're writing a paper. Not all papers require the same kind, so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'll direct your attention to some of the examples that I have posted in our Blackboard course and just a couple of tips to make sure that you are off to a good start with it. Okay, what is the literature? And it turns out there are actually several answers to that question. The first is that, most obviously it's the collection of accumulated knowledge about a topic. And, that's how you get smart on something. It's everything we know about topic X. But it's also a series of conversations and debates about that topic. So yes, it's everything we know, but it's also a whole bunch of people who have been writing and thinking and talking about this over time. And so, like any conversation, it has its ebbs and flows. It has its places of greater emphasis and lesser emphasis. It has its debates and disagreements, as you mentioned in a previous lecture. So it's not just what we know, but it's an argument about what we know. It's an ongoing, evolving conversation about what we know and why we think we know it, and so on. So that's an important piece of what the literature is. Again, however, the literature is also data. It's also the stuff we use to make arguments. So, a literature can mean a history of World War II. It can mean a case study about how Al-Qaeda operated. It could mean cost-benefit analysis of something. All of that is literature. And sometimes we think of it as things we know, and sometimes it's evidence that we use to make arguments. So it's that too. And this is, I think, the higher level way of thinking about literature that analysts and scholars use, that think of literature as, is it's a collection of theories, framework, and tools that can help you answer new questions. So people have created theories over time. They have created frameworks. I mean, if you think of the process of doing a cost-benefit analysis, that's part of the literature of many fields. And that's a tool that you go back into the literature, learn about it, discover it, and then bring it with you as you encounter new questions so that you can answer those questions. And interestingly, there are, of course, many literatures. So if you're interested in terrorism, you will be focused on the terrorism literature. But you may find that you may come to a point where you have a question that you need to answer that the terrorism literature doesn't have a good tool to help you answer. And the standard response for an analyst or a scholar at that point is to go, I wonder if some other literature has an answer, or at least a partial answer, a tool that I can use to answer this question. And so I might go borrow a theory from a different literature and then make that part of the terrorism literature. And so that's another way to think of the literature. So when you're doing a literature review for you, it has many purposes. First, and this kind of lines up with the what is a literature. First of all, you're reading the accumulated knowledge, so you're becoming an authority about that topic. That's obviously how you're going to learn, enough to say anything smart about it. But then, because you're listening to a series of conversations and debates, you're going to know what other people have already said. So when you get ready to write, you don't want to just repeat what other people have said. So you got to read the literature so you know what people have already said. And as I've mentioned previously, this way you're going to know what the major debates and disagreements about the topic are so that you can identify the most interesting and important places to be thinking and writing. You'll also have identified the deficiencies or the gaps in the literature, the things we just don't have answers to yet, or maybe questions we haven't even thought to ask yet, but that because you've now been diving into the literature, you're starting to ask and would like answers to. And because of having gotten those first 4 bullets down, you're ready to contribute to our knowledge about the topic. So that's the purpose of doing a literature review for you, the researcher. But when you're writing up a study, what exactly is the purpose of a literature review there? Because what it isn't is a linear chronology of your thoughts about everything you ever read. I mean, very likely you're going to read a lot more than you're actually going to cite in your paper. right? Some of the stuff you read is, yeah, sort of useful background knowledge, but it's not stuff you're going to actually cite. You don't have a reason to cite it. And so you're thinking, well, what's the sort of the general rule or strategy, or why exactly do I provide a literature review for people? What am I doing with that? And in a word, I think the reason is to provide your readers with context. If there was just one word answer to that, context, right? You want people to understand your work and what it's adding. And so you really need to provide a review of the literature that will help them understand the context of your work. So your readers need to know what has already been said on your specific question. They need to know where your work fits into the ongoing conversation or debate. If there's a debate between realists and liberals on a question, are you taking a realist side or are you taking a liberal side? Are you criticizing both? If you're adding a study about, topic X, have people already written a lot about topic X, a little bit about topic X? If there's been a lot written about topic X and you're writing about it now too, people are going to want to know why we still need anything more on this topic. You need to point out that there are still gaps in the literature, still deficiencies, still disagreements that need to be ironed out. And then you need to be clear about what your work adds that is new. If you're not doing something new, it's just an exercise and, a waste of time. So tell us what's new. And so by reviewing what has come before, you're able to say, all right, we know A, B, and C, I'm going to add D, right? Or we all agree on A, B, and C, but we have disagreements about D. Some people say it's caused by, this. Some people say it's caused by that. My study, however, is going to show that it's caused by this and that, you see. So a literature review is really about providing context. The Knopf piece that you'll read, nice short piece with professional students in mind, in fact, in terms of writing a literature review. And these questions are pulled sort of from the end of his, where he sort of sums up. This is the standard ground you should be considering when you write some kind of review section. And exactly what your review section will look like will depend on the kind of paper you're writing. But, most obviously, what questions has prior work addressed related to your research question? If you're measuring the effectiveness of the BioWatch program or whatever it is, what have other people said about this? Where does previous work agree or disagree on the question? Again, they agree on A and B, but C is still not yet well understood. If there are major theories or frameworks or perspectives that are competing over this question, tell us what they are, right? The worst thing you could do is not tell me if there's a big debate and then only tell me sort of at the end of the paper that, there was this big debate and I didn't know the whole time. So that's, there's a reason literature reviews are usually up towards the front of the paper so that I have the context while I'm reading what you're reading. And then you want to know, you want to tell people what the strengths and weaknesses of prior work are. Again, if you need to defend typically, or just explain, defense may be too strong, you need to explain why you're doing something on topic X when there's already been stuff written. And, people are people, they're not always right, they don't always do great work, sometimes they do shoddy work, or they make poor assumptions. And so if you want to wade in and say, look, I'm going to do this study of topic X because people have really been doing a poor job of measuring X and Y and whatever. So you need to tell people, what exactly it is you're disagreeing with, why you need new work, and then where does your work fit? With whom do you agree, disagree? Where do you add this new knowledge? So those are the basics. And exactly how you're going to do it is going to depend on exactly the kind of paper you write. Literature reviews can take many different forms, and so it will depend a little bit. Now, here are just a few. I'm not done counting all the different kinds of literature reviews or ways that people use reviews of literature, but here are a few big ones. The first big way people use a lit review is to identify the competing theories so that you could do theory testing or just sort of lay them out to critique them all. So a good example of this is Greg Koblenz's paper on the perils of prediction, where he outlines the sort of three different camps or views about how likely and how serious a CBRN terrorist event would be. And he outlines all three of them to then criticize really basically the whole approach to predicting these things. The Aaron Friedberg paper is a paper on the future of U.S.-China relations, and his whole article is an example basically of a literature review article, really, where he points out that there are liberalism, realism, and constructivism approaches to forecasting the future of U.S.-China relations, and that within each camp there are optimists and pessimists. And basically the whole article is outlining these 6 different camps and, noodling over the mechanics of why each one thinks it and so on and so forth. And then there's a brief section at the end where he kind of makes his own arguments, but really it's mostly a literature review paper. The Stuart Kauffman piece is a paper that very explicitly lays out 2 competing theories, rational choice and symbolic politics, with the goal of outlining hypotheses that each theory generates regarding ethnic violence, and then using the paper to test which one of them does a better job of explaining his particular case. That's a very time-honored tradition in the social sciences, is this theory testing. So this is a very common approach to literature review. I mean, Kauffman's writing about ethnic violence, for example. There are sort of an infinite number of different things that have been written about ethnic violence, but his research question is really a theoretical one. What is the best theory for explaining it? Is it this theory or that theory? And so his literature review is focused on those things. A different approach is to identify previous research on a general topic so that you can explain a specific case. So in the Nuzzo et al. Paper on the Ebola travel ban, for example, and this is a very brief paper, so this is a very, very brief literature review. In fact, you might even call it a wave rather than a review. But I think it gets you the point across here, which is the paper is obviously about arguing the idea that a travel ban on Ebola is a bad idea. How do they make this argument? Well, they make the argument by pointing out that previous research on travel bans for disease outbreaks generally have illustrated the following sorts of problems. Now, they haven't studied the Ebola travel ban because, remember, they don't have any data on that. It's just happening. People are just talking about it. So there's no data. You can't directly measure whether the Ebola travel ban that doesn't exist is a good idea or not. So what they've done is they've looked at previous research expressly as data and guidance to formulate arguments about a new topic. So that's a very common one. A third kind of literature review is one that identifies key themes from previous literature to justify the focus of a new study. So, for example, in this, and I've forgotten the authors here, sorry, but there's a piece in the folder about a survey of U.S. police agencies and their views about different terrorism issues. And so the literature review, which in this article is very sort of explicit and nicely set up, looks at 3 important questions about how people look at terrorism and says, these are really important things. Scholars have decided these are really important themes about how we think of terrorism. Now, what is a terrorist and what's terrorism and some other things. And they said, those are really important. And by the way, it's really important to understand what the police on the ground who are dealing with bad guys think about this. So they've identified the key themes and then said, all right, now we're going to use those key themes to build a survey and ask police, because that's something we don't know yet, is how do police think about these things. So that's a really good example of using a literature review to identify important things, and then you take those and you find a new way to explore them. A fourth example is to borrow a theory from a different field to use to help answer your question. I mentioned this, and a great example here is the article Eye for an Eye by Peter Lieberman. Lieberman wants to know why people support wars, and there are many reasons, but the thing he's interested in particular is this notion that some people supported the war in Iraq because they thought Saddam needed to be punished. And so he, now security studies doesn't really study things like that, so he goes to psychology and borrows theory about retributiveness and people's desire to punish others who have been wrongdoers, and he uses that to generate a framework for thinking about how people support war. And it is a very good example of borrowing a theory from a different field, psychology, to answer a question in the field of security studies. A fifth and a very common literature review is this sort of the straight up, I'm going to study how effective terrorism is, and first I'm going to review the literature and point out all the people who say terrorism is really effective and why they're wrong, and then I'm going to present some evidence that they're wrong. So this is a very straight up approach. So this is the Max Abrams piece, Why Terrorism Does Not Work, and he lines up all the people like Bob Pape and others who think that terrorism is a good strategy for getting your way, and he says, they think this, that, and the other thing, and they're really weak on this, that, and the other, and I'm going to show it. And then he presents data to that effect. So those are sort of 5 very common ways to think about what kind of literature review you might be doing, what work it's doing, and by knowing those things, it's going to help you figure out how to write them. A few notes on what not to do. The one most important thing is do not write a book report section of your paper that just summarizes each of the articles or books you've read. If you must read journal. You've read a lot of journal articles for class over the last couple of years, and I guarantee you have never read a literature review section in a journal article that looks anything like that. So neither should you. You should not write anything like that. Your literature review in anything you ever write should be organized thematically, not just author by author. Thematically, according to the purpose of your literature review. Right? There are 3 important things to know about the literature on this topic so far to date. Topic 1 is this, topic 2 is that, topic 3 is this. And then within each, of course, you will discuss specific authors. Right? But the point is not to say, hey, I read this thing by author X and here's everything they think. That's not what we're doing. The second key thing is do not discuss any works that are unrelated to your research question. You need to stay focused so you don't confuse the reader and get wandering off onto the side trails. One of the sort of blessings and curses of doing this kind of work is you read a lot of interesting stuff. The curse is that sometimes you get, you feel like, hey, I read this, I'm going to tell you about it because I read it. You don't do that. And related to that is don't make it any longer than necessary. The literature review is context setting, but it's not the main event. So you want to hit the high points and have it do the work it needs to do to get people ready to read the meat of your study, but you don't need to waste time on it, right? This is a place where 3 main points and move along is usually just fine. Okay, some strategies for success, just to leave you on a high note. The number 1 way to do this is to find journal articles that have the same basic approach, purpose, method, structure as yours. If you're doing a policy analysis piece, then go find several different policy analysis journal articles that have, sort of maybe the same kind of scope and flavor as yours, and look at what they've done with the literature review section. It may not be called that. It may be called something very different, but it might be called background. It might be called literature review. Might have a more descriptive title. See how they've treated the literature review section, and then shamelessly copy all the good ideas that they present for how to discuss previous research. And I think you'll be in very good shape. And of course, feel free to ask questions. That's what I'm here for. All right, I hope this has been helpful in helping you think about your literature review, and I look forward to discussing this with you guys online.